Okay, so let's start. A warm welcome from Dachau to the world. Today, as our second live stream hosted by 3 different memorial sites. Today, I have colleagues from Bergen-Belsen, Neuengamme, and Dachau with me to talk to you about the liberation of the 3 concentration camps. This event will be live streamed on YouTube and Facebook. So if you're not interested to be seen in the whole world for years, please switch off your camera and your microphones. We will have the opportunity to discuss questions you have via the chat function, as well as our visitors on YouTube. You can use the chat function and I will read the questions and ask my colleagues. My colleagues today are Steffen Jost from Dachau Memorial site. He's the head of the educational department. In Neuengamme, I'm with Lennart Onken. He is a member of the scientific research department. And in Bergen-Belsen is Tessa Bouwman. She is a member of the educational department. We will have 3 short stations in all the 3 memorial sites, and yes, I think we're ready to start. So if you have any questions, type them in the chat function, and the first to start today is Dachau, Steffen Jost. Please start and introduce the topic today.
Mikros an? Sehr gut. Okay. Hi, warm welcome also from me to everyone. My name is Steffen Jost, and I'm standing here in the museum at the Dachau Memorial site. And yeah, we are standing in it's the memorial site at the so-called main camp of Dachau. And when we go a few meters around here, the thing is that it's hard to talk about the time shortly before the liberation without realizing that this was not just about the main camp in Dachau, but also about a network of subcamps that were visible all over southern Bavaria. About 80 of them were still operated by the SS by the time of the liberation. And about half of the prisoners that were liberated here in Dachau were liberated in the subcamps or the so-called death marches. And the living conditions at the end of the camp were simply horrible, and this was because the main camp, as well as many of the subcamps, were totally overcrowded. In the Dachau main camp alone, about 30,000 people were imprisoned in these last weeks, and what I have with me is a head count written down from April 26th. And you get here in the first row, you get an idea how many people were in some of these barracks. These were barracks that had been built in the 1930s and had been built for about 200 people. By now, the majority of them was housed by more than 1,000 people. So you might get an impression on how terrible the living conditions in here must have been. And more than 100 people were dying every day in Dachau and its subcamps at this point, not because the SS was actively killing them, but they were creating conditions in which typhus and different fevers were spreading, and people were just dying because of these epidemics, because of hunger, and because the SS was still forcing people to work even in the last few weeks before the liberation. Then one of the other things that was happening during these last days was that the prisoners in Dachau were forced on so-called, on so-called death marches, because the SS was on the one hand forcing people from other or evacuating other concentration camps that were on the brink of being liberated Allied forces and were evacuating these prisoners into the parts of Germany that had not yet been overrun by Allied forces. And Dachau, well, was one of the last camps that was still operating at that point. And so the SS had by then, there was a lot of uncertainty among the prisoners at that point. There had been rumors about that the SS was willing to kill all remaining prisoners in the concentration camps. Prisoners in the camp, part of the camp resistance, intercepted, for example, a telegram from Heinrich Himmler, who said that no prisoner should be taken alive by the Allied forces. And so the SS was forcing a lot of prisoners on so-called death marches. And you can see here the Dachau main camp, and a lot of prisoners were forced then, especially near the Alps, where some members of the SS still hoped to fight the Allied forces in a so-called mountain fortress, and still hoping for a last kind of wonder weapon that would still turn the war around at that point. So these were the conditions that the Americans encountered when they were nearing Munich and Dachau. And at that point, the knowledge of the Americans also was very slim, actually. And just to give you an impression about that, I have a quote by a man called Lieutenant Jack E. Westbrook, was part of one of the divisions that liberated Dachau. And he describes in his memoirs what he actually knew about the camp. Up until April 29th, 1945, the majority of us in my unit were not aware of the Nazi efforts to exterminate the Jews, certainly not its scope nor its effect on the world. And certainly none of us were aware of the Dachau concentration camp. We had been briefed stateside on the unjust imprisonment of large numbers of people by the Germans and their being forced into a kind of slavery. But nothing could have prepared me for what was to unfold in that small Dorf, north and west of Munich in Bavarian Germany. So this was the point that how it was shortly before the liberation. And the next stop, when we go back to Dachau here again, I will talk shortly about what was happening actually on the day of the liberation on April 29th. But before we go now to my colleague in Neuengamme, are there any questions?
There are no questions yet.
Okay, perfect.
So
then thank you very much. And the next stop is Neuengamme.
Yeah, this clinker brick building we just left is one of the buildings that are still preserved from times of the National Socialist concentration camp here in Neuengamme. In this block, the so-called Schonungsblock was located. In the Schonungsblock, the particularly exhausted, emaciated, and sick concentration camp prisoners were housed. In the eyes of the other concentration camp prisoners, they were considered as death candidates. Odd Nansen, one of the Norwegian prisoners who came to the newly established Scandinavian camp here in Neuengamme in March 1945, remembers in an entry in his diary his impression when he first saw this clinker brick building. He writes, "The clinker brick building was a two-story high stone structure that looks quite impressive from the outside, but from the inside, it looked so bad that you will not forget what you have seen for a long time. There is a misery that goes beyond all boundaries and concepts. In each bed, there were 3 to 4, even 5 or 6 men. It sounds incredible, but I saw it myself. Most of them were just skeletons and didn't need much space. They lay there very calmly. They had no strength to move. They just lay there to die." Odd Nansen came to Neuengamme together with some 4,000 Scandinavian prisoners from different National Socialist camps, detention centers, and prisons to the newly established Scandinavian camp here in Neuengamme. They all were to be evacuated as part of the White Buses operation, which was initiated and organized by the Danish and Swedish Red Cross. With these white buses here, with the Red Cross on it, some 5,000 people could be rescued in total from National Socialist concentration camps. And for some 4,000 of them, Neuengamme was their last station before freedom. The Scandinavian camp was set up here in the Schonungsblock, where previously those death candidates were housed and had to live. But therefore, first of all, those death candidates had to be brought somewhere else. They were sent to death camps, most of them to Hanover and Salzgitter. And also for these transports, these white buses here were used, which you can see here on a photograph, right, standing in front of this SS main sentry post behind me. So these buses, which were actually intended to rescue people and to save the life of the people, thus transported others to almost certain death. And this caused enormous feelings of guilt, both among the survivors and the drivers of these white buses. So if we're talking about the last weeks here in Neuengamme, we have a simultaneity of rescuing and mass death, and both were deeply interlinked. But now, when we heard the stories of Neuengamme and Dachau, I'm quite curious how the situation before the liberation looked like in Bergen-Belsen. Maybe you can tell us more about it, Tessa and Stephanie.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lennart. Hi from Bergen-Belsen. Before I start talking about the situation right before the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, I want to show you where we are right now, actually. We're at the former main camp street, and I brought a map with you to show you where we are. I have to turn it around. So we're here now, and during our little tour, we will go into this direction. So just for your orientation. So actually, the situation in Bergen-Belsen was very similar to those in Dachau and Neuengamme when it comes to the conditions. So both the hygienic and the sanitary conditions in the huts were very miserable. And this was due to the overcrowding because very many prisoners in the last months and also weeks before the liberation of Bergen-Belsen were brought here from other concentration camps, were evacuated here, either on death marches or also by transports, and this led to the camp being very overcrowded. And I also want to read a quote to you describing the situation in one of the huts. In the huts, people were lying on the floor in the stench, ridden with disease. There was no light or water. They were just wasting away. The sick, the hungry, and the dying had to stand up or sit on top of each other. There were dead bodies all over the floor, and they would only occasionally be taken away. The floor was covered with a stinking mass. The situation was a complete disaster. People were too weak to move, and so the entire camp became one big latrine. So this quote, on the one hand, mentions the fact that there were very many people that were ill, but also mentions the fact that there were very many people dying and that the corpses were actually starting to pile up. This quote also mentions that sometimes the corpses would be taken away. And this was actually something that was started by the SS as kind of a way to deal with the bodies. They actually kind of established a death detail. And one former prisoner talks a little bit about this work detail, described it, and I want to read another quote to you. To remedy the situation, the SS men then put together the most gigantic and macabre death detail that I have ever seen. All of the prisoners who can stay on their feet are driven out of the blocks. And in groups of 4, they tie cords or parts or braces or belts around the limbs of a dead prisoner and drag the body in this way for more than a kilometer to the mass graves. If only there had been an illustrator to record for all time this extraordinary procession which surpassed the most morbid of fantasies. On the way there, they walk one behind the other in the midst of the dusk, kicked up by the bodies dragged over the ground, these horrifying groups of living ghosts. As they drag this unknown comrade by his 4 skeletal limbs to his final resting place, which will soon be theirs as well. His head bangs against the stones along the way and scrapes roughly along the earth. So in this quote by Michel Flix, who was an inmate, he actually mentions that he would have wished for someone to be there to record this practice of taking care of the bodies and bringing them to their last resting place. And there was actually someone who did exactly this, made a drawing of this. This drawing was made after liberation. I hope you can see it. So you can see exactly this practice of prisoners. You can see the uniforms dragging a corpse to the mass graves, and in the back you can also see some of the huts. Okay, so that will be it for the situation directly before the liberation. And I will directly continue with actually the liberation, the moment of liberation. This practice of taking care of the bodies and of people dying actually lasted up until the day of liberation, which was the 15th of April, 1945. But it didn't stop at this day. Actually, this practice continued afterwards as well. And for us now, for us working here at the memorial, and also for many others, I guess, interested in the history of Bergen-Belsen, the topic of liberation also this day is a very central day. But yeah, the experience of the prisoners back then might have been a bit different. For them, maybe it wasn't such a pivotal moment as we might see it now. So I just want to read a few impressions from prisoners talking about this moment of liberation. We realized that the end was near because the SS men and the SS women were walking around wearing white armbands, and a white flag of surrender was hanging over the camp. So we knew that it was coming to an end. But we also knew that we couldn't last much longer. I knew that I was losing strength by the hour. Another one, I went out and someone pointed at a tank near the entrance to the camp. And they said it was a British tank. But it didn't get through to me anymore. It didn't seem to make any difference. My mind was so weakened and exhausted, it just didn't make any difference. I knew my mother was dying. I knew I couldn't last much longer. And then last one, when the English arrived, they lifted me up. One held me here and one down there. I was only skin and bone. I weighed 29 kilos. You may not believe it, but my shoulder bone would have fit through this. So this shows that that for some of the prisoners, that this moment, of course, they felt that something was going on, but not so much was changing for them in that moment, because they were still feeling so bad, and they were emaciated, and were still in hunger and pain. Family members were dying all around them. Yeah, it didn't really change so much. I think I'm gonna skip this. So we're just gonna continue a little bit more, I guess, right? And I just want to show you a picture that shows the situation, yeah, a few days after liberation, actually. You might know this picture since it's a very famous one. Was it the cover of the Life magazine, I suppose, in April?
Time Life.
Time Life, yeah. And this actually shows, a boy that survived Bergen-Belsen, and see the corpses lying around here. So what I mentioned before, so many people dying, this is something that continued after liberation as well. And this burying of bodies, because there were so many of them, wasn't something that was done in one day and then the camp was cleared, so to say. It was something that went on afterwards as well. As you can, I can show the picture again. So as you can see here, back then it really looked a bit like it looks now, also with the trees. And we picked this spot to show you. We do not exactly know where this where this picture was taken, but it was somewhere in this area, and we just wanted to show you a bit of the surroundings, so it's easy for you to kind of imagine. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Then I would hand over to Neuengamme.
Before we head over to Neuengamme, there is a question for you, Tessa. Could you please name the source for the quotes you read out?
Sure, yeah, I think I'll probably do that afterwards. We can maybe collect all the quotes and the sources that we use, and then we can post it somewhere. I think that would be easiest, right?
That's a perfect idea.
Yeah.
Thank you, and let's
no
hand
problem.
over to Neuengamme.
Yes, in the meantime, I switched to our main exhibition, to the part which deals with the end of the Neuengamme concentration camp. Because these pictures and photographs we just saw from Bergen-Belsen do not exist for Neuengamme. When the British troops came to Neuengamme and liberated the camp on the 2nd of May 1945, they found the camp completely cleared out and without any prisoners left. Until the end of April 1945, some 9,000 prisoners from the Neuengamme concentration camp were brought to the Lübeck port. There, they were put on board the ships Cap Arcona, Thielbeck, and Athens. Hamburg's Gauleiter, Karl Kaufmann, had previously confiscated these 3 ships, which now became floating concentration camps. Under completely inadequate conditions, these 9,000 prisoners had to live under deck on board these ships. They suffered hunger, thirst, and diseases, and many of them died utterly devitalized. But then, on May 3rd, 1945, disaster struck. British bombers flew an erroneous attack on the ships Cap Arcona and Thielbeck, which were fully loaded up with concentration camp inmates bobbing in the Bay of Lübeck. The British bombers mistook these ships for German troop transports. And while the Germans were able to escape by jumping in the water, more than 6,600 concentration camp inmates were burned, drowned, or were shot by the SS while swimming in the water and trying to save themselves. Only 450 people survived this catastrophe. One of them was Philip Jackson, a survivor of the Neuengamme concentration camp and the bombing of the Thielbeck. He wrote in a letter dated the 8th of May 1945 to friends of him who lived in France. Since I was a very good swimmer, I managed to reach one of the 3 lifeboats the Germans had sent out. I was rescued before they knew that we were prisoners. After they found out, they only saved their own sailors and soldiers and simply let several thousand prisoners drown. The first 150 to reach the shore were shot by the SS. This is the latest news about my father. One of the few Frenchmen saw him swimming with a board about 100 meters from the ship. He was already in trouble. I did not find him among the survivors. So, while the camp of Neuengamme was already liberated, completely cleared out, and without any prisoners left, the suffering of the concentration camp inmates was by no means over. For some of them, it even took more than a week until their liberation finally came. This picture here, for example, illustrates and shows the liberation of the last concentration camp inmates of the Neuengamme concentration camp complex. These are prisoners from the Neuengamme subcamp Wilhelmshaven Alter Banter Weg on board the ship MS Homburg in the port of Malmö on the 11th of May 1945. And this is their exact moment of liberation. They had undergone a 25-day-long evacuation transport from Wilhelmshaven to Flensburg, where they were put on board the ships and sent to Malmö. But on board the ships, there still were concentration camp guards. So these prisoners, just experienced their liberation when they entered the port of Malmö, and finally Nazi terror for them had come to an end. So only 3 days after the unconditional surrender of the German Reich, and after all other camps had long since been liberated, the moment of victory over Nazism had come for them too. And how was the situation in Dachau? I have no idea if you are asking questions.
Okay. Okay, welcome back to Dachau. We are standing now in front of the so-called Jour house. Jour, French for day, it was the house of the day watch. So the main entrance into the concentration camp, and was here that American forces encountered the majority of the prisoners here in the concentration camp. In particular, were the 42nd and the 45th Infantry Divisions that liberated the camp. And the 45th Infantry Division, they encountered the camp first not here at the prisoners camp, but about a kilometer in that direction where the so-called SS training camp was. And in this SS training camp at the outskirts of the camp, they encountered a train. It was called the so-called Buchenwald Train or Buchenwald Transport. This was an evacuation transport originally going from Buchenwald to Flossenbürg with 4,500 prisoners. So it was standing behind me about a kilometer, and it was meant to go to Flossenbürg, but the commanding officer of this transport thought that Flossenbürg was already liberated and derailed the transport to Dachau. So the transport came to Dachau 20 days after it had started in Buchenwald, and at that point, from the 4,500 prisoners, only 816 were still alive. There were over 2,300 dead bodies in this train, and this was the first thing that American forces encountered when they came into the camp. So to get an impression of what the Americans thought about these camps, these were the first things they thought, just piles of dead bodies, actually. So this was on the 29th of April at noon, and then during the next hours, was discussed with the remaining SS forces how the camp should surrender. And at around 17 o'clock, the remaining SS forces, the commanding officer was actually a 23-year-old man that had been made commanding officer here of the camp 2 days ago. The original SS forces had been fleeing towards the Alps a few days earlier. And he surrendered the camp at that point to General Linden of the US Army. And I brought a picture that there you can see where we are standing right now. So this is General Linden standing here on this part of the bridge right here. So this is the SS man commanding the camp at that point. But you can already see the prisoners themselves have already spread over the camp borders. They're looking out of the windows. They're inside this monument of power, actually. So this was the power central of the concentration camp. And this point of the liberation, the prisoners have been taking over this part of the camp. And so we might go a few meters in that direction. Today, the US forces are commemorated with 2 plaques here on the right side, on the left side, 2 plaques commemorating the liberation of the camp. And this mirrors quite exactly, especially how the prisoners themselves felt about the American forces liberating the camp. And let's go a few meters in that direction. In here, because this is what the Americans then encountered. They were, as soon as the rumor spread, the news spread that the American forces are here in the camp, the prisoners that, well, those that were still able to walk, went out of the barracks and were greeting the American forces. So this is a picture taken from one of the watchtowers along this way. And you can see also here prisoners inside the so-called death zone, also here, that they would have not been allowed to go on during the time of the camp. And yeah, so at that point, the many of the prisoners, well, simply couldn't believe what was happening actually around here. There had been some fighting with remaining SS forces. The SS had executed some of the SS men under the impression of, especially of what they saw in the so-called Buchenwald Train. And so, but there were over 30,000 people here in the camp, and many of them hadn't really realized what was actually happening. And I have a quote by a man called Edgar Kupfer-Koberwitz. So this is him here, shortly before the liberation. Those who were perhaps in our first tour that we did with these three camps, memorial sites, know him. He was also in Neuengamme as a political prisoner. So that's him after the liberation, and a press photo for his the diary he kept here in the camp. And he remembers in his diary, he notes how he encountered an American in the so-called sickbay barrack. And if you look behind me, you can see it just a little bit. There are these barracks behind me, and especially the ones on the right were the so-called sickbay barracks. Soldiers in the sickbay barrack, an American, a giant in a steel helmet, smiling, very calm and chewing gum. "Hello, boys," he says. They surround him. Everyone shakes his hand. Anyone who can speak a few words of English says them to him. The little Italian lawyer, an elderly man, crawls out of bed, goes there, shakes his hand. He stands next to the giant like a dwarf. "I thank you for all that you have done for us," he says, and looks up with big red eyes, at the big soldier. He says, "Oh, that was nothing, just a little skirmish." And he walks through the room, surrounded, all hands reaching out to him. He begins to sing. "It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. All sailing along, he leaves again, all call, all wave." So you see, it's a little bit like a Hollywood movie, and we see this actually in memoirs of prisoners quite a lot. This form of describing the Americans that came here into the camp as superhuman, as somebody unreal. And I think it tells us a lot about how unreal it must have felt for these prisoners at that point to become liberated. And so if there are any questions, you may ask them now.
There are still no questions, so we can hand over to the next stop.
No question.
Okay, no problem. Then I'm just I've lost my. That is, I have to look up who is next, but perhaps Dominik knows and may simply give over. It's to Bergen-Belsen. I'm very sorry.
Hi, so this is Stephanie right now. I took over from Tessa. Actually, Tessa showed you this picture of the young boy, Siv Maandag, in the women's camp of Bergen-Belsen a few days after the liberation. This photo was taken by George Rogers, and it's quite famous, as she already pointed out. This is what the camp looked like a few days after the liberation. When the British soldiers arrived here, they have not been prepared for what they would encounter here. And they were, I suppose, very much overwhelmed by what they saw in this on-site Bergen-Belsen. They saw thousands of corpses, dead bodies, some already decaying, and they met those thousands and thousands of prisoners in different states of starvation, sickness, and so on. So the two major tasks that they really faced in these first few days was, on the one hand, burying the bodies and the corpses, and on the other hand, trying to take away the surviving people from this site that was still infested and full of diseases. So at the same time, two things were going on in parallel: the digging of mass graves and the burying of the corpses, and the transfer of the survivors to the nearby garrison area. On the one hand, the burying of the corpses was in the beginning carried out by the former SS guards. They were forced to perform some of this work, to perform this labor. And you can see this on one of the pictures taken by a British soldier who was a member of the Army Film and Photographic Unit. They also took a lot of footage that you can today find in the IWM collections, as well as the photographs, of course. So on the one hand, this was one of the big tasks here. And one of the results, if you like, something that is left from then is this mass grave, as well as some other mass graves in the area of today's memorial. Because they tried to get rid of the diseases of this campsite, it was an easy, or one of the easiest solutions was to burning those wooden barracks here. That's why today there are no barracks left, and there's hardly anything left of the topography of the camp, but more a park-like area and the cemetery, these mass graves mainly. On the other hand, the survivors were taken from here to the nearby garrison, and one of the major buildings, the former officers' mess, was turned into an emergency hospital. And you can see a picture taken from the dance hall there, where beds were put up to have this work as a hospital. And we also have the memories of one of the British medical students who came here to help, and in May, actually. And he remembers, and he writes in his memories: after supper, I went up to the roundhouse to have a look round, found that they had converted the banquet dance hall into a ward, and that it contained about 200 beds, and that all rooms off the two flanking passages which used to be the German officers' rooms, had been converted into wards. The two large semicircular rooms jutting out at the back of the buildings, because they had such large windows and were so light, had been made into TB sanatoria. This is how Michael Hargrave, then medical student, remembers the roundhouse, the situation of the banquet hall here. On the other hand, there were still people staying here at the former campgrounds, and some of them died also after the liberation. For these people, some family members put up personal memorial stones, or if they died a few days after the liberation, they even tried to have them buried properly in single individual graves. And we have a picture of one of these efforts we have a picture of the grave of Sarah Trompeter, a young woman from Poland. And from this picture, you can actually see that this is somewhere in between the barracks where she had stayed during the time of the imprisonment. She died on April 23, 1945, and was buried here. Later on, this grave was moved to somewhere else, and her sister put up another memorial stone that you can see on the one hand on this picture when she visited this, and you can also see it just right next to us. I don't know, maybe if you can see it from the sun. The sun is bright. But these are really the things that were going on right after the liberation. You had both sides. You had survival and people trying and struggling and surviving, getting better, recuperating. And on the other hand, you had others still dying after the liberation and being buried here and remaining in Bergen-Belsen. I don't know if there are any questions. If there are not, I would hand over to Dachau again.
There are no questions, so we can just switch to Dachau.
Okay, so we are back in Dachau, and so the camp was liberated on April 29th, but of course, the liberation did not stop, for example, typhus or the fevers going around in the camp. So for the Americans after liberation, there were two things very important that they had to do here in the camp. The one was documentation. They had to document the atrocities committed here by the SS in the concentration camp. And so what they actually did, so you can see here, this is a picture showing prisoners on the camp road after liberation, picture taken by photographers of the US Army. So they were going around the camp and documenting everything that they found here, especially, of course, the piles of bodies that were to be found between the sick bay barracks and especially in the crematory area, because the bodies had not been buried in mass graves for a few days before the liberation. So that's what the American forces found here. The other thing, what they needed to do was they had to take care of the liberated prisoners. And so this meant on the one hand that they, for example, built a hospital. About 300 personnel from special army divisions were brought here to Dachau to build 2 field hospitals. And these field hospitals began their work already on the 3rd of May, so only 4 days after the liberation. And not here in the main camp. So if you look over here, so in this part of the camp road, that's where the sick bay barracks normally were, but these were not real hospitals. So the Americans built these hospitals or operate this hospital out of former SS buildings in the SS training camp. And they treated about 10,000 prisoners there. And but still about 1,500 still died after the liberation, despite all the treatment. For all the other prisoners, still they try to care, for example, with vaccinations or disinfection. And what you can see here is this is a man called Georg Tauber. He was a so-called asocial prisoner here in the camp, and he drew or painted a lot of scenes from the camp and from the liberation. And so, for example, this is a scene where former prisoners get vaccinated by American soldiers, which you can see here. And here, former prisoners that, well, as you can see, still look very malnourished. And so he painted another one from shortly after the liberation, with showing American soldiers disinfecting former prisoners. So the prisoners themselves were meant to be repatriated by the US. Of course, many of them didn't have a home where they actually could be repatriated to, but still from the mid of May on, a lot of the prisoners were actually repatriated. And just one thing I forgot, sorry. But before that, while they were still in the camp, one thing that was very important for the prisoners was to commemorate actually the camp and to commemorate the comrades that died here in the Dachau and in general in the Nazi concentration camps. And I found a very interesting picture. I mean, there was a big official camp-wide commemoration on the 1st of May on the so-called roll call square. So that's the square you can see behind me. So that's the big square of the camp. And on the 1st of May, there was a big celebration with flags, with representatives of different religions. There was a military rabbi there, for example. And so this was like the first official celebration of liberation. But many of the national committees here in the camp also did their own celebrations. And I found an interesting picture showing the Yugoslavian prisoners here in the camp commemorating the liberation 2 days later on the 3rd of May. So with a handmade picture of Tito there in the middle. You can also see here there's some female prisoners, former prisoners here during the liberation. I mean, Dachau was a camp for men, but shortly, especially in the weeks and months before the liberation, women came actually here to Dachau into the camp. So there was also women here when the camp was liberated. After that, the camp was getting emptier and emptier. So prisoners were brought out of the camp. They were brought in DP camps and so on. And so then, as you might say, this part of the liberation ended, and Dachau was not any longer a concentration camp, and became something else. And well, now 70 years later, or 75 years later, now it's a memorial site. So thank you very much for listening from Dachau, and I think we'll hear one last time from my colleague in Neuengamme.
Yeah, we are still standing here in our main exhibition. But as we already heard, the Neuengamme concentration camp was liberated, completely cleared out, and without any prisoners left. The survivors experienced their liberation somewhere else, in different places all over Northern Europe. Some were liberated in Sweden, as we already heard. Some were liberated in the reception camps Sandbostel, Wörbelin, and Bergen-Belsen. Some were liberated in Neustadt in Holstein, and some were liberated somewhere else. But of course, many of them still had to suffer and still had to die in the last weeks of their concentration camp imprisonment. I just for this live tour, for this guided live tour, I digged out 2 exhibition panels from a special and traveling exhibition we just curated here in Neuengamme. The name of this exhibition was Survived, and now Hamburg victims of Nazi persecution after their liberation. Because even though Neuengamme was liberated without any concentration camp inmates left here, the British troops liberated in total more than 100,000 people in more than 570 different National Socialist concentration camps, forced laborer camps, detention centers, and prisons in the area of Hamburg. And that meant that an enormous number of people were awaiting care, treatment, and registration by the British troops. But since housing was hardly available in the badly and heavily destroyed city of Hamburg, the British troops instructed the survivors to stay in their barracks, which were now refunctioned as displaced persons camps. We already heard some words about what DPs were. As DPs, all those people were considered who had been deported for reasons of war and now had been liberated far away from their hometown. Even though also Neuengamme was for quite a while such a DP camp for a couple of weeks, the biggest DP camp in Hamburg, however, existed on the Heiligen Geistfeld in Hamburg, Neuengamme. It was the DP camp Zoo. Some 80,000 people passed through this DP camp in only a couple of months. From there, they were sent to so-called national camps, so to Polish camps, to French camps, and from there, they should have been repatriated quite soon and quite fastly. Until September 1945, the majority of DPs could be returned to their countries of origin. Only some 7,000 displaced persons remained in Hamburg. These were mostly Poles, which feared the political change in their country of origin, and Jews who did not want or who could not return to their hometown because they lost all their belongings, they lost their house, and they often even lost their complete families. So they did not want to go back to their hometown or to their former village because they said that they want to start a new life in a new place. But returning home also was an option for those Hamburg citizens who had been persecuted by the Nazis and who had also been deported to different places all over the German Reich and therefore also had been liberated far away from their hometown. And also they hoped that the returning to their hometown would be one first step on the way back to a normal life. But the situation they really faced here in Hamburg when they came back was often quite different and very challenging. This, for example, is the case for Esther Jonas Leiner, who later was called Esther Bauer. Esther was the only daughter of the Jewish school principal Alberto Jonas, who was the principal of the Jewish girls' school here in Hamburg, and the doctor Marie Jonas. They lived in a quite comfortable flat here in Hamburg-Eppendorf in the Voitzenweg 5. But in 1940, the Nazis forced them to move out of their comfortable flat and to move into a Jewish house. In 1942, they were deported to Theresienstadt, where the father was murdered. Esther survived a martyrium of different concentration camps, for example, Auschwitz, until she was liberated in Flossenbürg in the south of Germany. She was the only one of her family to survive the Shoah. Somehow, she managed to return to Hamburg and asked the military government for allocating her a flat. And indeed, she was allocated a flat, and indeed, she was allocated her old flat, but only as a lodger. And she had to live as a lodger in her old flat with a physician called Dr. Schwake. Dr. Schwake had joined the National Socialist Party in 1933. Once the family, Jonas Leiner, were forced to move to the Jewish house, he had occupied this comfortable flat in Hamburg-Eppendorf. And now, Esther Jonas Leiner, as the only survivor of her family, came back to Hamburg, asked the military government to allocate her a flat, and she got the flat she formerly lived in, but not as the person who rented this flat, but only as a lodger next to that guy who profited from the deportation of her own family. Of course, this was not at all what she had expected, and though she chose to emigrate to the United States. And this story shows us that with the liberation from the concentration camps, suffering for the survivors was by no means over. And the way back to a normal life and starting over was very, very challenging and quite different for all of them. Are there some more questions?
Lennart, thank you. There was a little bit confusion. You mentioned that the DP camp zoo was in Neuengamme, or was it in the city center of Hamburg? There was some confusion.
Yeah, there first was a DP camp also here in Neuengamme, but the DP camp zoo was a different DP camp. And this DP camp zoo existed on the Heiligen Geistfeld in Hamburg, St. Pauli, so almost in the city center of Hamburg and not here in Neuengamme.
Okay, thank you very much for this clearance. I can't see any further questions right now, so I'd suggest let's come back to the plenum, and you would now have the last opportunity to get answered some questions you have. If there are not any questions anymore, I would say thank you to those following us on YouTube, and thank you for watching us. Please follow us on our websites and our social media accounts, where we will provide some further information also about this event today and further events coming. Thank you to our visitors on YouTube, and for those on Zoom, for the participants here on Zoom, we will have the opportunity to have a little discussion right now. But first of all, I will end the live stream on YouTube.